Strange thoughts have a way of crossing the mind in moments of crisis, I am told, even among those who do not suffer the incursions of intrusive thoughts, as I have all my life. It was the 21st of October, 2016. A week earlier, on the 15th, the celebration of my 23rd birthday had been dampened by the death of my grandmother. Now her family and friends were gathered at St. Francis of Assisi Parish in Burien, Washington, for her funeral. In the midst of the to-be-expected sadness and tension, a less anticipated emotion flickered suddenly in my chest. A curious thought had crossed my mind, the memory of some words I had read in a book, the words, "For many reasons I dislike the Roman Catholic Church." And suddenly my fingers were curling, my brow furrowing in disgust. A reaction distinctly different from that which had affected me when I first read those words approximately 2 years prior. The words which so troubled me at that moment have their origin in a book whose spine glimpsed periodically at Barnes & Noble used to disturb me with much the same emotions for years, that is, until the November of my sophomore year of college, 2013, when with the stomach-swooping enlightenment of a religious revelation in reverse, I came to the long-overdue realization that not only did I not believe in God, I never had, and in fact had no desire to believe in God and still don't. The book was Richard Dawkins' The God Delusion. When after several months as a budding atheist I finally purchased the book in question and sat down to read it, I was happy to allow myself to sink into that comfortable ease which accompanies the affirmation of all that one is predisposed to think and believe. Not exactly a new way of looking at the world, for I had spent years torturing myself with the thorny questions of existence, and had endured crises of faith without count before the final sundering. But rather a more inquisitive, broad-minded way of looking at the world began to open up before me in the pages of Dawkins' analysis of religion and science. The implausibilities and contradictions of established religious doctrines so neatly and concisely rebutted. There was only one recurring motif in the text which occasionally made my mouth twitch, and that was Dawkins' assessment of the Roman Catholic faith. Early in the book, Dawkins, like Christopher Hitchens in God is Not Great, shares the old Irish joke in which a man is pulled over by a group of revolutionaries demanding to know his religious affiliation. Attempting to turn himself into a non-combatant, the man replies that he is an atheist. Yes, but a Catholic atheist or a Protestant atheist. Both Dawkins and Hitchens use the joke as a segue into their own enduring relationships with religion, namely their lingering affection for the Anglicanism of their birth, acknowledging the influence of religion in their personal lives, and both falling decidedly into the Protestant atheist category. Later in his polemic, Dawkins goes on to lambast the Catholic cult of sainthood, decrying the alacrity with which these people just make stuff up, among other things, among many other things. Also on his list of targets is the sacramental law allowing any baptized Catholic to baptize any other person into the Catholic faith. Having at that time only recently severed my own connection with the Church, having continued attending Mass ever more reluctantly throughout my sophomore year of college, I certainly sympathized with much of what Dawkins had to say about Catholicism, particularly his refutation of Aquinas' 5 proofs of the existence of God. Yet I could not help flinching ever so slightly at the 2 passages mentioned above. In the case of the Catholic veneration of saints, for the shallowness of Dawkins' analysis, glazing over the long history of veneration of ancestors inherited from Judaism, which went into the centuries of in-the-making doctrines concerning sainthood, as with all other Catholic doctrines, and which any serious analyst could not, therefore, very easily decry as merely making stuff up, even if I do ultimately consider it to be as fictional as every other metaphysical assertion of religion. In the case of the latter, for a much more personal reason. All my life I grew up with the story of how my maternal grandfather was baptized by his own mother shortly after his birth during the terrible Seattle blizzard of 1915, a decision whose urgency was prompted by the strong likelihood of infant mortality under such conditions. My grandfather was never a particularly religious man, and until the age of 15 I was not a practicing Catholic, yet I always found the story heartwarming and still do. which is why I was not particularly pleased to see this practice likewise dismissed without any particularly deep analysis by Dawkins, though I was also not entirely inclined to fault his assertion that it might be considered disturbing for the largest church in the world to grant the power to its members to baptize any random person into their membership. More importantly, while Dawkins may have occasionally raised my eyebrows, I remained broadly pleased by what he wrote, in proud defiance of the church I had so recently rejected, in defiance of the Newman Catholic Campus Ministry of Western Washington University, which had so negatively affected my first 2 years of college, and in defiance of the traditions of my family, though of all my relatives only one, my paternal grandmother, was ever truly a devout Catholic. This was the grandmother who now lay in her open casket in a pink floral dress, the wizened remains of 88 years of stubbornness and conviction, a woman to whom I had never been particularly close, save during those few years when I was still living at home and attending Mass regularly. A closeness of acquaintance which I am still grateful to have experienced, in spite of how it ended. So there I was, surrounded by grieving relatives and friends. There was good old Father Dick Hayatsu in his pastoral robes. There was the stained glass window in the annex casting its colorful light over the coffin. There was the poster with the oh-so-touching image of a warm fetus, and the helpful information that a heartbeat begins at 40 days. And into the midst of my thoughts drifted the recollection of a quote that would no doubt have elicited a memorable reaction from the woman in the coffin, probably why I thought of it in the first place. And it made me angry. During the car ride to the parish, my mother had mentioned her late mother-in-law's old wish that just one of her family members would be able to say the Mass properly at her funeral, because she was convinced that God would turn to her up there in heaven and marvel at what a brood of bad Catholics she had reared. Sure enough, not one of her 4 remaining children was able to participate fully in the Mass as it progressed, nor many of the friends of the family, and only one of her many grandchildren present on the occasion. Myself. The atheist. As far as I know, though I could be wrong, the only decided non-believer of the Lyons family. We did not talk very much to begin with in my family, and even less to talk of religion, so who knows. It was amazing how easily it all came back to me, the rituals, the responses, the rhythms, the cadences. At that point in time I had not been to Mass for at least 2 years. Before that I had been to Mass almost every Sunday, and sometimes other days, for the better part of 6 years, close to probably 300 times. Why did it all come back so easily? It never truly left, nor has it yet. What is it that I love so much about the Catholic Mass? Is it relatively common knowledge? Catholicism is built upon ritual, upon mystery, intonation, formalism, hierarchy, contrasted customarily with Protestantism with its center on the individual, on personal prayer, on reading the Bible, on one's so-called personal relationship with the Almighty. To utilize a Nietzschean dichotomy, a great many people would probably associate Catholicism with what Nietzsche called the Apollonian and Protestantism with the Dionysian. Apollonian columns juxtaposed against Dionysian revelry, Catholic formality versus Protestant folksiness. American culture has always been primarily Protestant to begin with. Now in our post-60s flower child sexual revolution world, it is treated as a given in many circles that fun equals good, not fun equals bad. And of course Catholicism cannot be fun because it is well known for its formality. I have lost count of the number of times I have been informed that going to church with Catholics is boring, by people who have never been inside a Catholic church in their lives. So Dionysian equals good, Apollonian equals bad. Protestantism equals Dionysian, Catholicism equals Apollonian. I would disagree with this assessment. Camille Paglia, the influential academic and legendarily controversial lesbian feminist, herself a Catholic-raised atheist, associates Catholicism with paganism, with the Mediterranean culture of her Italian ancestry shared by me on my mother's side, a culture of beauty, of sensuality, reflected in Catholicism's obsession with the power of visual representation so often decried as idolatry among Protestants. This alone, in my opinion, is enough to prove that Protestantism is not truly Dionysian. Else, why this anxiety over the power of a tangible object such as a small painted statue of the Virgin? The Dionysian is all about the breaking down of boundaries between objects. There is none of this in the essence of Protestantism, not even in the arm-waving, eye-rolling revelry of their so-called worship services with their misappropriated rock music. Such experiences, for all their loudness, contain little communality. The whole point is to make the individual feel transcendent, wrapped up in their own personalized blanket of God's love, not part of a greater whole beyond oneself and the divine. In a word, the essence of the Apollonian. The frenzy with which the evangelicals throw themselves into these performances is not a product of any shared passion for the divine within themselves. It is a reflection of how dulled their senses have become, deadened by their egocentric need for fun and popularity, the result of a yearning for the Dionysian, exacerbated by its total excision from Protestant culture, a reaction against that cold, gray, blockish thoroughfare of ideas. Only a person completely lacking in spiritual interest could feel any need to reconcile God with pop culture, much less find it conceivable to do so. Yet this is precisely what millions of Americans experience every week as religion, or, since religion smacks too much of the Apollonian for them, as a relationship. How did Protestantism come to this? From the moment Martin Luther nailed his theses to the door, the Reformation was founded upon individual agency. It is worth noting that this is not exactly what Luther himself had in mind at the beginning. The theological anarchy which resulted was rather a result of the fact that Luther's teachings were not popular enough to unite the majority of Europe against the papacy, but they were enough to catalyze the fury of millions of uneducated people and some educated people oppressed by the church-centric socio-political codes of medieval times. Not one reformer was ever able to produce a set of doctrines that could rival the Catechism for breadth and consistency, which is why the early Protestants spent as much time fighting each other as they spent fighting the Catholics. Eventually realizing that they had to band together to avoid being crushed beneath the heel of Rome as so many heretics had been before them, they began to work out a rough tolerance for one another's denominations, and so Protestantism remains to this day, a loose coalition of constantly fluctuating churches, synods, subgroups, ranging in formality from the near-Catholic high church to the sometimes outright cultish. At a societal level, the result of this theological incoherence has long been a culture of individualism, to put it lightly, and sometimes accurately. It is also increasingly a culture of narcissism, a culture of consumerism and consumer capitalism. If you're wondering what this has to do with religion, remember that American culture has, from its founding, been grounded in the Protestant work ethic. It is true that one does not necessarily have a fun time at a Catholic Mass. As much as I have always enjoyed the experience, I would not describe it as fun. In my mind, religion and communalism are not supposed to be fun. Neither is political involvement, reading, friendship, work, any of those activities which give life meaning and purpose. There are many things in life which are pleasurable and yet not exactly fun most of the time, nor should they be. At the risk of sounding a Philistine, I say fun is like anything else, a good thing in moderation. Not such a good thing if it has to insinuate itself into every single aspect of one's life. Religion, for instance. Catholicism is a religion of beauty. Catholicism is a culture of beauty. Catholic rituals are a work of art, perfected by 2,000 years of practice, founded on Jewish practices far older. Who knows where the rituals of Judaism have their roots and influences? To take part in ritual is to take part in history, to break down the barriers that separate the present from the past. To engage in ritual as a community is to break down the barriers that separate individuals from one another. To partake of the blood of Christ in the form of wine is to consume the substance sacred to the God who gave the Nietzschean dichotomy half its name, the Dionysian. How does this translate into the individual experience of the Catholic atheist? Polio would say that it is reflected in her lifelong love of beauty. The great film critic Roger Ebert wrote often of the influence of the Dominican nuns of his schooling as a pivotal influence upon his social and political worldview, claiming that they must have all been New Deal Democrats. Even the famously anti-theist comedian George Carlin conceded that the only good thing ever to come out of religion was the music, I would say also the art and architecture. Personally, I would say that Catholicism is reflected in my utilitarian philosophy of morality, my belief that rightness is to be measured in regard to the common good, that individual responsibility for good and bad behavior is to be measured by what was intended with regard for the common good. Which is why I was startled, but not in an unfamiliar way, by the spark of anger that rose in my chest to think of Dawkins at the hour of my grandmother's wake. While I continue to value Dawkins for his arguments and his bravery in promoting such a controversial set of views as his own, my disgust over his shallow treatment of Catholicism endures. In his wonderful book Assholes, A Theory, the philosopher Aaron James includes Dawkins among his list of examples of specific well-known figures whom he deems assholes. In Dawkins' case, because he so often deviates from his sound scientific arguments for atheism to delve into egotistical ranting, considering himself privileged by his own supposed rightness to brush off the views of billions of people, giving what James calls sloppy treatment to philosophical arguments which have preoccupied thinkers for hundreds of years. For my part, I would say that Dawkins is a little unkind himself to Dawkins, but the broad thrust of his point rings true. What form Protestantism is inclined to take in those who abandon it, I cannot say with as much surety. To judge by Dawkins, Hitchens, and the few Protestant-raised atheists of my acquaintance, it seems to be reflected in their tendency to assume that argument, logic, reason, scientific evidence, etc., all exist primarily to justify them in what they are already inclined to believe, to the exclusion of all else. In the same way that Protestants frequently seem to decide what they want to believe first and then go through the Bible to find a way, any way, to rationalize their beliefs, no matter how many passages they have to decontextualize and otherwise distort. This is what I mean when I say that I am a Catholic atheist. When I say that I am an atheist, and I hesitate to call myself an atheist, to be honest, not because I agnostically entertain doubts about my own non-belief, but because, as Ebert put it, the term implies too great a certainty about the unknowable. I am not merely saying that I do not believe in God. Merely to not believe in God is no great feat. Anyone can look at arguments, point out inconsistencies, point to alternatives, and reject postulated conclusions. Ultimately, neither arguments nor counter-arguments have anything to do with whether one is an atheist or a believer. I became an atheist when I finally realized, through intuition as opposed to rational conjecture, that I could not believe. Atheism is a spirituality of its own, one which is diminished when we focus too much on science and other forms of ideological theory. We live in a Dionysian universe. Everything is a part of everything else. Religion cannot be excised from the human experience by any amount of atheism. Religion is an inescapable part of atheism. Every definition of the word atheist that I have ever come across contains either the word God or some other reference to the rejected divine. For those of us who have been raised to be religious, this is especially true, and unfashionable though it may be in American atheist circles and many other circles, I am grateful to have been born into the Catholic faith. Catholicism has contributed to my love of beauty and my love of humanity. It has also gone too far and hurt its own cause, as has every other religion. This does not diminish my love. This is why Dawkins and other atheists occasionally infuriate me with their ignorance. This is why it made me furious to read of Donald Trump appointing a chaplain who has described Catholicism as one of the world's great false religions. I will never forget the 2016 election night for many reasons, but the most prominent of my memories concerns a news interviewer at a Trump rally inquiring of a man dressed in what appeared to be a pilgrim costume regarding his reasons for supporting the presidential candidate in question, to which the man responded that he believed his chosen candidate would save the country from the influence of the Latin immigrants sent to the United States as spies by the Roman patriarchs to do their bidding. Like Dawkins, I entertain no great fondness for the Catholic Church, but for better or worse, it is a part of who I am. I certainly appreciate that Protestantism, especially evangelical Protestantism, is not a part of who I am and never will be. One need not be Catholic to revel in the warmth of pagan beauty, but in this time and place there are few other opportunities to do so. Maybe someday there will be. Until then, I, like so many others, shall remain a rather Catholic sort of atheist.